Right, so welcome to this evening's session. So just to remind everybody, so you have joined this meeting muted and with your video recorders off. We would just ask that you remain muted during the session, the presentation, just so that to aid the speaking session just helps. Just if you've got any questions as we go through, please pop them in the questions box or chat function. And then at the end, there's an opportunity that if you want to ask questions using your voice, then that's more than welcome. So tonight's session is the third and final session of our webinar series, and tonight's session is on natural capital. I'm very pleased to welcome Oliver Cooper from BCM, who is kindly going to give us a run through about what natural capital means for farms, and a bit of a roundup also on where we are with ELMS. So as I say, do please pop some questions in the chat box as we go through. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And then we welcome questions at the end. So I'm going to pass over to Ollie.
Thank you very much, Robin. Can you hear me okay, Robin?
Yeah, very good.
Good, brilliant. So just a quick introduction to myself. As I'm Oliver Cooper, I work for BCM, who are a land agency firm based on the Isle of Wight. I'm a partner within the firm, so as part of my day job, I do rural land management valuations, but also principally I now advise on natural capital and look after that for the firm's sort of wider offices on the mainland in Winchester and Oxford as well. I'm also a sort of fairly small scale farmer on the Isle of Wight as well, which I sort of try and fit around a 9-to-5 job as well. So not just in an office, but also occasionally getting my hands dirty in that process. So I'm here today to provide a bit of an introduction as to what is natural capital, how does it work, what is its background, where does it come from, and what can it mean actually on a farm basis, and potentially what are the benefits for farmers and land managers. And I'll also roll that into a bit of a chat about ELMS as well, because they are ELMS is constructed on the principles of natural capital and payments for ecosystem services. So I'll come to that towards the end. It's going to be a fairly sort of swift presentation, and I hope that that'll provide at least enough sort of background for us to have a sort of more open conversation about natural capital at the end. So as Robin said, if you've got any questions, then pop them in the chat box below or just save them up for the end. So yeah, so just starting with some basics. Natural capital as a term is the stock of, as the slide says, the stock of natural resources, including geology, soil, air, water, and all living organisms. So that's the core asset base of natural capital. And then ecosystem services, quite a mouthful, is the services and the benefits that are derived from those assets. So in a more sort of conventional approach, arable land is conventionally your asset, and the services that it derives are the crops that it can produce. But also that soil also has the potential to sequester carbon through accumulation of organic matter and things like that. So there's the sort of physical aspects that you produce, but there are also the ecological and natural benefits that are delivered from those assets. And as such, a lot of what natural capital is about attaching vocabulary and data collection to something that is fairly intuitive to a lot of people, to a lot of farmers and land managers. So that's some of the very basics. Why is natural capital become an issue? You don't have to go far these days to come across news stories or bad news stories on the environment or biodiversity. We are undoubtedly in a period of climatic change, which is due to get worse unless there are fundamental changes to sort of the accumulation of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. That's also mirrored by collapses in biodiversity, and that's not just in England, that's a global factor, but there's no reason why we can't challenge that in our own backyard. And a lot of us will be familiar with some of the criticism that agriculture and farming comes up against as part of that, but it is not the only industry that has problems in its production cycle. But conversely, agriculture and land management probably has more in its armory in terms of addressing the wider scale problems. I mean, land use in the UK, 70% of which is used for agricultural production. So it's got that massive potential to deliver huge benefits, whether that's air clear or sort of clearing up air quality, managing water quality and water flow, improving habitats for wildlife, sequestering carbon, and also sort of, yeah, lots of those things, public access, history, landscape, loads of things that that can be delivered through natural capital. So that's undoubtedly the reason why natural capital is at the fore of this conversation, because we are in a sort of significant, one of the most, a huge economic problem, ecological problem, and land use is seen as a way to potentially address that. And it's so, where does natural capital come from as a concept? It's been in circulation for probably over 50 years. I think E.F. Schumacher, who is an ecological economist, is generally regarded as being the sort of founder of the concept when it was talked about alongside things like social capital and cultural capital. But it wasn't really adopted into sort of a political narrative, particularly in the UK. It arrived in probably about 2012 when the Natural Capital Committee was first founded and chaired by Dieter Helm, or Professor Dieter Helm, who is a fairly well-regarded ecological economist. And they have been driving the inclusion of natural capital into economic and land use policy. And they've only probably had a relatively minor impact until recently, but I think actually this growth of what is now going to be ELMs and also things like the polluter pays principle that's coming through in the Environment Bill all link back to the principle of natural capital being embedded in government policy. The most recent addition to the sort of policy narrative is the Disruptor report review, which was, the report was released earlier this year, and that was basically commissioned by DEFRA to provide some sort of quantification as to the economic benefits that are derived from biodiversity. So across the wider economy and the public sector, what is the value to UK GDP from biodiversity? So it was DEFRA essentially trying to make their case to HMRC and the Treasury as to why they need funding for natural capital, which is quite often regarded as being actually one of the cheapest ways to deliver a lot of these reversers in climate change, biodiversity crisis, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, instinctively, we probably all know that nature has an essential role in delivering economic and social benefits, but the concept of natural capital is about measuring, recording, and valuing those benefits. And it is not, as you can imagine, it's not necessarily that straightforward, and it is still a process that is being refined and developed, and it will never be perfect, but it is about trying to quantify it and using sort of standardized assessments to enable certain sectors to pay principally land users to do different things with their land use that will offer a beneficial result that could offset or other people's polluting impacts. So that offers an opportunity then for, as I say, landowners and farmers to potentially sell those benefits on to other people who need to offset their pollution impacts, which are considered necessary as part of their, or unavoidable as part of their business. So who pays then for natural capital? I've sort of alluded to it a little bit a moment ago. Carbon trading is one aspect of natural capital, and one that's probably the most established of all. Albeit saying that, at the minute, is principally driven by either very large businesses or philanthropic interest, where people are looking to voluntarily offset flights and things like that, or businesses are looking to use it as part of their corporate social responsibility. But there is very limited compulsory requirements for carbon offsetting. That will most likely change within the next decade as we approach requirements for reaching net zero by 2050. Carbon trading is expected to be a very active market. And again, so where does that fit with the natural capital? Land use can be changed to sequester carbon. Principally at the minute, that's recognised through woodland planting and peatland restoration. But there is growing bodies of evidence to say that soil carbon should be tradable as well, which will obviously be an enormous boon for the agricultural and land use sector. Nitrate offsetting has been a particular hot topic within the Solent area, because following a court case about 3 or 4 years ago, it was decided that developments that contributed to increased nitrates in a special protected area, which is a European designation, would essentially not be consented unless you could show that they had no net impact on the nitrates. So that provides an opportunity for housing developers who, when creating new housing, have nitrate sort of runoff from their properties or surplus nitrate being returned to the watercourses, that they can offset that by paying someone to take an activity out of another nitrate outputting activity. So in this case, quite often farming, where things like dairy farming and poultry and things like that are considered very high nitrate sort of output activities, can be paid quite significantly to stop doing those activities. But that model is pretty active within the Solent area, and it has held up quite considerable development within the Solent region, whether that's Portsmouth, Southampton, New Forest on the island as well. The development for biodiversity net gain, so that's again developers paying for where they're going to be having a potentially damaging impact upon the biodiversity of an area. They can purchase biodiversity credits to essentially offset that loss, but the principle is that you are actually improving the overall biodiversity, so you get this net gain position. So you'd have to demonstrate that you're purchasing more credits than are being lost. But again, it's an option for landowners, particularly those with environments that are similar to those being lost. But water companies will also pay for natural capital. There's existing examples of that across large parts of England, where a lot of water companies are responsible for water quality, and also they have requirements to contribute towards flooding issues. And in both examples, land use can be adapted to both improve water quality in catchment areas, where the cost of cleaning and removing sort of residual pesticides or fertilizer or high levels of nutrients from water can be an enormous cost for the water companies. So actually paying farmers and landowners to change practices is actually much cheaper than the cost of removing it. And the same with flood defences, where cost of hard infrastructure around towns or downstream from farmland can be much more expensive than trying to introduce some different water management approaches higher up in the catchment area. Corporate investment within the sector, I think it is already a growing market, where businesses are looking to engage in different types of positive land use. There are examples on the Isle of Wight of companies supporting particular environmental projects. And green prescriptions, we're probably all aware that there are enormous benefits from being out in the open countryside, and it's something that's recognised as being positive for mental health and well-being. And as a result, there is an expectation that people may be actually provided with the opportunity to go out and experience that in a sort of aid to help mental health. And then the final aspect that I've just listed there is ELMS, which I'll come on to in a little more detail in a minute. But essentially that's a possible route for the government to fund natural capital in ways that the private sector are not sort of willing or able to either monitor or pay for. The polluter pays principle is essentially what drives all of these different payers for natural capital. So the polluter pays principle is one of the key tenets of the new Environment Bill that's currently in the report stage at Parliament, and will probably pass through in the early part of the summer this year. We're hoping to do it before Parliament goes into recess, but we'll see. And the polluter pays principle will essentially mean that those that are polluting will be responsible to pay for the damage that they're causing, and that can potentially be through offsetting. Obviously, there'll be a drive to try and reduce pollution, or they're hoping that the costs associated with pollution will actually mean that a lot of people will try and reduce pollution at source. But for certain sort of industries or activities, that won't be possible, and there will still always be an element of residual pollution that will need to be offset. And that is where, again, farmers and landowners have the potential to offer a market for offsetting that polluting aspect. So that's all well and good in principle, but actually, how does it translate into sort of more practical approach? How do you actually go about assessing what natural capital you have to sell for carbon trading or for nitrate offsetting or similar? So this is the general approach that we take when looking at natural capital. So we'd conduct an initial scoping visit, which is a pretty basic collation of data associated with the sort of core physical attributes of the land and the activities that are taking place. So you can sort of start to build a picture of what activities are happening on the land, and therefore what potential is there for, or what interaction does it have with different sort of flows. So whether that's proximity to water courses or roads and settlements and things like that. So how you interact with those different environments. And then that can lead on to a much more detailed appraisal of all those things. So you can start to build up a model for essentially the different carbon activities that are arising off the activities on the land, but also what carbon is sequestered through the land use. So potentially through the soil sequestration, any woodland on the holding, and other details like that. And you can start to build a valuation model off that based on the relative balance of different physical flows of ecosystem services. So carbon is the easiest one to monitor. It has much more tangible levels of in and out, and there is quite a recognized market for how much that pays for. So that's the example that a lot of people will always use, but actually we're seeing markets starting to open up and data being available for sort of hydrostatic flows for water courses as well. So you can measure from how your farm or land holding sits within a water catchment area. And similarly with air quality and public access, knowing how many people use a public right of way. And there is then some assessments that have been done to actually put a value on that use of a right of way as essentially a public good. And it's obviously, there's no market for that. There are very few people who are paying for that benefit, but there is a benefit derived from it, and there is a cost associated with that being there. So there's a relative balance that you can start to do to assess the whole value of natural capital and the flow of ecosystem services that come from that. As I mentioned before, it's not an exact science, so to speak, albeit it is incredibly detailed, the measures it goes to. I think George Monbiot's been quoted once very rudely of saying, It's like natural capital is like marmalade. It goes in and it gets pulped and chopped and scrunched, and what comes out is complete gibberish. And obviously he was being quite rude about it, but it is a truth. In reality, it is enormously complicated and is not an exact science, and you will never capture everything perfectly. And at the minute, the numbers that are attached to it are quite often a little bit speculative until some of the markets sort of develop. But this is very much the direction of travel that is being pursued by the government. So just moving on to, the next stage after an appraisal, to actually market some types of natural capital and the related ecosystem services, they need to benefit from some sort of consent or verification. So as an example of that, with nitrates, that requires a Natural England approval to assess that that site is suitable in relation to the watercourse and the activities that are proposed to actually reduce the amount of nitrates coming off the land. And then similarly with carbon, that's assessed usually through the Woodland Carbon Code if it's arriving from woodland. And I think we'll see some more sort of rigorous standards coming out for the assessment of natural capital across the board. And I think we'll see generally adopted standards for the sort of whole concept of natural capital as well. So that phase of the process in terms of acquiring those permissions or sort of certificates of compliance and things will be more important and will be directly linked into the appraisal phase. And then the next aspect of that is actually identifying a market for those ecosystem services. And sometimes that a lot of the approaches that have been done so far, because there are very few markets in the form of you've usually only been looking at nitrates or carbon principally, actually you've orientated your whole appraisal and gaining permissions to the market that you knew was there. Whereas actually, when there are more markets opening up for natural capital and ecosystem services, you'll be better off actually assessing everything and then maybe presenting a whole package to the market for those different offerings. But that will sort of evolve over the next 12 months. And then you go through a sales process. So preparing, exchanging and completing on sale contracts. Some of those contracts may be fairly complicated, and then a lot of the deals that we've been involved with so far, most of the parties that are involved have been learning about it, whether that's the purchasers or other sort of councils that are involved. It is new to them. They are very unfamiliar with it, and they're very nervous about it, I suppose, because they don't want to be perceived to have sort of messed up on it. But it's very quickly starting to evolve into a more accepted process, and people are understanding what's involved. So that is becoming more normal. Some groups of solicitors or some firms of solicitors are now much more familiar with preparing the private environmental contracts, which cover the sale of natural capital. So that is becoming an easier process, thankfully. So that's roughly the process that we'd go through. And I thought I'd just outline a few practical examples of natural capital projects that we've been involved with. So sustainable drainage schemes, as we talked about before, local authorities and water companies in this case were concerned about downstream flooding. So they looked at how that could be managed on a catchment basis. So they essentially prepared a hydrological assessment of the whole water catchment area, and they know that they needed to retain more water higher up in the catchment area, particularly for flash flooding incidents. They looked at, and we agreed a process for river rewiggling, introducing leaky dams, not as far as beavers, but essentially they're recreating a lot of they're classified as ecosystem engineers, which is another waffly word for they do things that are beneficial and change the environment that they're in. So that, yeah, they helped to reduce the flood risk downstream, and they were paid for by the water companies and the local authority. Again, nitrate offsetting, I've talked about it quite a lot as an example, but it's essentially paid for by developments that would otherwise increase nitrate output. And in those cases, deals have been done to either plant woodland, which is obviously a very low nitrate use of land, but also agreements have been put in place for watercourse management, and also for lower input uses of land, whether that's low input pasture and things such as that. So then the next bit I was just going to come on to was the public goods. So everything we've talked about at the minute has had a private market, really. So a water company's been willing to pay for it, or companies or businesses that are activities are polluting. So they're all private entities, and they need to offset their sort of private pollution. But there are lots of public goods that are derived from environmental services. So clean air and plentiful water, that sort of mixes up a little bit with the water companies, but even things like clean air, protection from mitigation of environmental hazards. We want thriving plants and wildlife, the beauty and heritage of the landscape, including access into it. So those public goods, who is going to pay for those? And I think increasingly that looks like ELMS is going to be the principal delivery mechanism for public money for public goods, which was one of the founding principles that ELMS is built around. So it's about trying to deliver these benefits that are otherwise not going to be paid for by the private sector, but are something that is widely delivered by land use. I mean, that whole list of things, agricultural, farmland, sort of classic Isle of Wight landscapes, they fit within that very closely. So then that does lead me on to the conversation about ELMS. Unlike previous schemes, countryside stewardship schemes, HLS, ELS, ELMS is designed to be based on this natural capital principle rather than a sort of income foregone type model. But I think in practice that may prove to be a little hard for DEFRA to engage with. So we may see that income foregone is actually their default in place of actually valuing natural capital, particularly for these public goods that have no real market for, and you're trying to make hypothetical assessments. So ELMS is due to also being introduced as part of a post-Brexit and end of common agricultural policy, end of basic payment scheme. And I'm not going to go into the depths of phasing out of basic payment and the changes that are arising out of that. That would almost be a whole nother webinar in itself. But what I wanted to do is quickly just cover the 3 tiers that are currently being proposed for ELMS and just how they fit into the sort of natural capital picture. So we've got 3 tiers: sustainable farming incentive, which is essentially the lowest of the 3 tiers, and then there's local nature recovery and landscape recovery. So the sustainable farming incentive is generally considered to be the more basic engagement with delivery of public goods from agricultural land. The options are, or the management options as they would previously have been known under an environmental scheme, are called standards, and they have different tiers within those standards as to how much, what the expectations are, or the requirements are, not expectations, if you enter into those standards. And they all relate to essentially agricultural uses. Some of the other tiers are open to what they call farmers and land managers. This scheme is designed around farmers. So, I mean, save for the improved grassland standard, the basic level of that would be to have a minimum sward height, to remove some areas from cutting or grazing. But yeah, a higher standard of that, for which you might be paid up to say £97 a hectare, is a much more complex mix of sward heights, including soil mapping, precision application of fertilizer. So you get an idea, and those sorts of things will be designed to restrict sort of fertilizer runoff and improve water quality, improve air quality, enhance biodiversity and habitat offerings within that farmed landscape. So they're all things, again, that are the public goods, generally speaking, that are being delivered through that landscape. So we know most, sorry, just go back to that one. We actually know the most about the sustainable farming incentive because a pilot was launched, or pilot is in the process of being launched. So there's been sort of limited amount of information released, but there's more information due out in June this year. So that'll give them more information on timescales and length of schemes and how it's going to interact with possibly these other two tiers that I'm going to talk about. So the local nature recovery and the landscape restoration, which are the two sort of medium and higher tier levels, they are due to have pilots in 2022. So at the minute, we only have a very limited pool of information available as to what they will involve. But at the minute, the local nature recovery scheme is understood to be a bigger scale scheme. So sort of farmers will be expected to collaborate together or deliver more specific aims in terms of things like creating and managing habitats, woodland, peat, species-rich grasslands. So it will focus on those higher level options, also about delivering potentially new rights of way or recreation and educational infrastructure. So it's definitely that next level up of management, and hopefully the payments will reflect that. The final tier, or the highest tier, is landscape restoration, which is looking at really big bespoke schemes. I mean, the pilot that they're looking to run next year, they've indicated that their projects are looking for about 2,000 to 3,000 hectares. So that means it's going to be limited to either very large landowners or farmer cluster groups, which I think are going to be pretty central to this top tier. You look at the drivers that they've been pushing forward to encourage farmers to work at this level in terms of cooperation. I think it's one of the things they actually liked from what they saw in the EU. There are sort of Netherlands and things that do quite a lot of farmer cooperation groups and interactions on their environmental stuff. So I think that this is going to be driven towards that. So, and we'll focus on some pretty big landscape management schemes. So, so that actually takes me to the end of the sort of scripted part of the presentation. So I'm happy to take questions and generally just chat things through. I'm sure you'll all have lots of thoughts on it. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ollie. That was really interesting. I think, you know, it's a very relevant topic at the moment, something that's certainly gaining a lot of interest, and as you say, plays very neatly alongside the ethos for elms and the element of public goods, and really the government's intention to create a market for what you can't sell alongside your produce, I suppose. So I mean, from one of the things I was sort of going to ask, do you think that we're going to hit a stage where sort of DEFRA or the government's going to provide sort of a standardised assessment tool and maybe even sort of a standardised market, or do you think this is always going to be a very much kind of public sector sale?
I think the ideology behind natural capital is that it is something that can exist within the private sector, so that it can be something that's traded by businesses, and there is sort of set, say, a British standard for natural capital assessments, which is essentially a privately monitored and enforced set of systems. So I think that's why they've been fairly light touch up to now, and I think because of the polluter pays principle, they think that will essentially enforce a process. But whether, because it is going to be such a sort of shift for a lot of sort of corporate entities and things to actually look at buying ecosystem services for offsetting and things like that, I think we're going to see it needing a bit of a kickstart from the government. We saw that with woodland carbon, where they set up their sort of woodland guarantee schemes and the reverse auctions for that. Although there was a market, and there is still a market for the trading of woodland carbon, they introduced the reverse auctions, the government did, and it essentially provided a bit of a structure for those to take place and to try and develop a market, because before there was no one really competing or organizing that, whereas since that has developed, there's now been a boom in people offering trading platforms for woodland carbon and things like that. So I think they'll want it to be light touch if they do intervene, but I'm not convinced we're going to see a DEFRA standards for natural capital assessment.
And so as a farmer, do you think there's also an element there of being mindful about retaining some of the credits for yourself? You know, if we're going to get to a stage where people are going to have to offset their own activities, I mean, is that something that you think farmers need to be aware of when they're working out what they've got as saleable items?
Yeah, I do think it's an issue. I mean, at the last budget, I think there's already sort of conversations about, say, removing tax benefits for red diesel and things like that. So I think there is going to be a general trend or a sort of maybe a slow glacial shift towards putting pressure on sort of farmers to essentially pay for their own polluting aspects, which I think as part of your natural capital assessment, you are only ever going to be looking to trade away your surplus. So say with like I'm talking about carbon, if you're able to sequester a lot of carbon through woodland and hopefully in the future through soil, that will hopefully exceed the amount of carbon sort of released through livestock numbers and things like that. And I know there is a sort of ongoing debate about how livestock greenhouse gas emissions are actually calculated, and at the minute a lot of the standardized processes are not particularly favorable to livestock, but doesn't mean that there can't be an accumulated surplus which could be sold off, but only that surplus after you've already essentially offset the existing carbon emissions from the farm. And actually that as well comes back to how you tackle, there are changes you can make to try and reduce carbon inputs. And I know your previous two sort of speakers as part of the presentation series have probably done that much better than I will, but actually tackling your carbon outputs will generally actually help you reduce your cost outgoings as well, because carbon usually relates to cash. So
definitely relevance there. I mean, so talking about that surplus thing, Claire's asked a question: if land is already in HLS or stewardship and therefore maintaining a certain standards, will payments still be received, or is that restricted to the creation of rather than the maintenance of? So I guess that's talking about where are you going to have to demonstrate improvements to actually look at finding that sort of saleable credit?
Yeah, so the direction of travel is that it has to be a change. It's about this is your existing position, what happens if you what will result if you make a change. So but the challenge is there is no sort of set baseline, and the principle of natural capital should actually pay you for your net position at day one. So if you're already sequestering carbon through the activities you have, then you should be able to get paid. But actually that doesn't generate a gain, so to speak, because that carbon is already being used to offset the existing sort of production elsewhere, albeit you've never been paid for it. But it shows that already the existing land use and natural capital is already absorbing an enormous amount of carbon and is already providing water filtration and air clearance, but actually it's got the potential to do more, and that's what they're trying to leverage. It's those extra things. So if you are already within a scheme that's paying you to do certain things, so say like low input grassland or something like that, where that's actually about trying to provide habitats and flora and stuff, I think you will obviously that will probably be a public good that will probably be replicated by an ELM scheme, is my anticipation. So but I think there'll be other schemes that will be more orientated towards the private markets. So there will probably be less, there'll be more at a sort of contrast with ELS and HLS. There'll be slightly different land uses. So.
I mean, just talking about the recording, I suppose, and the quantifying of livestock. I mean, there is some suggestion about whether the new methane sort of counting and appraising record will come, whether the UK will adopt and reflect the system that it looks like they're going to be bringing into the EU. So I mean, I think that it comes to this sort of constant shift, doesn't it, in how these things are assessed, how they're appraised, you know, and that standardized metric, and where you draw the line yourself on your farm, and whether or not that's going to be appreciated and reflected in whoever's looking to purchase that, really, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's where it actually comes back to your first point about the sort of set standards for these things, because actually at the minute, particularly sort of even business carbon assessments can vary enormously on terms of what levels of their emissions they actually check. So how much of their business's footprints do they take into account the carbon footprints of all the products that they import as well, and their supply chain that feeds into that, and the different scopes that they assess carbon on is quite important. And that's going to be the same on farm and with land use. And I think we will see a market evolve, and with a lot of the carbon trading that is happening, they're governed by, or not governed, but there's standards called PAS 50 and most recently PAS 60, which essentially set standards for what has to be included within that scope for carbon trading, but not all carbon trading happens at those standards. So that's why woodland carbon has been the easiest to measure, because it's got a very standardized process. There's a long history of measuring and recording woodland growth in trees, and it's very easy to quantify. And I think actually as we get to a process that evolves, that where soil can be monitored in a similar way, then but it does take a big body of sort of scientific research and data recording. And I mean, there was technology that I was reading about earlier this week that I said essentially a gamma detector that sits on the front of an ATV that can measure the released sort of boron and calcium and half-life that comes from that, and essentially can therefore estimate how much soil carbon there is. And it takes sort of 800 tests per hectare, or 800 data points per hectare, so it can build up the most detailed carbon mapping that's available out there at the minute. So that's the sort of technological developments that will help soil marketing evolve, or soil carbon marketing.
On that carbon thing, Matt's just asked, is there a likelihood that food retailers will be required to assess the carbon of their products to include food miles and production methods? And I know I have been involved in conversations where people are concerned about sort of beyond red tractor standards, whether supermarkets, if you're providing a product to one of their schemes, whether they might start to put in place requirements about carbon levels and carbon footprints as a producer.
Yeah, I was with a Waitrose buyer a couple of years ago, and he was adamant that they wanted to introduce carbon figures on their products because they saw it as potentially being a USP that would appeal to their market. I mean, we've struggled to even get standardized approach to nutritional information on food products. So I think we're still a little way away from it being a standardized requirement for food carbon, and especially where, as you said a minute ago, it is fairly hotly disputed as to what those actual figures are from livestock. But I think it is something that will potentially grow. I mean, we're seeing people marketing things like the carbon neutral steak already. So it may be something that can be used as a marketing tool potentially for those that want to, but I don't see it necessarily as being a standard that's just around the corner. I mean, also, I think it was Arla, wasn't it, have conducted essentially carbon audits across their entire, or I think it's across their entire supply chain, which is obviously an enormous data collection activity, which suggests that they've probably got something in mind for actually using that potentially as a marketing tool if the results come back as they, or at least come back positively. So
that's very interesting. I mean, I think there's also something to bear in mind. Quite often with these conversations, there's an issue talking about productivity, and Matt's raised that as many of the trading concepts require a reduction in productivity on farm. There is a struggle with the idea of pushing food production overseas, and really how we balance that. We're reducing our impact, but are we just moving it elsewhere? Because many of these countries are less efficient for food producers than the UK, generate a far bigger environmental impact without considering the food miles. He's asked, how do you think this impact is being considered by policymakers? And, is that part of the consideration when we're looking at some of this? It's all well and good us improving what we're doing here, but if we're just shifting our conscience and impact elsewhere, where's the benefit? I mean, great example at the moment with this Australian trade deal, really. Is it logical and ethical to be talking about importing products in this direction and shipping counter products in that direction? Where did the food mast sit there, I suppose, really?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that at all as a sort of principle to export carbon elsewhere. And it's one of the greatest flaws in actually sort of nationalized carbon accounting. I mean, we measure how much carbon is produced by the UK, but it doesn't take into account the fact that actually now all of our vehicle manufacturing is done in Germany, India, China, and we just import them in. So yes, we've reduced the amount of carbon we've produced, but also our car manufacturing industry has collapsed. So I couldn't disagree with that more in many ways. But on top of that, though, I'd say it is a slightly more nuanced actual discussion, because I think there are benefits that can be derived through a focus on carbon and possibly even on soil management that will actually deliver both environmental benefits and potentially also commercial benefits. And I think that arises out of a sort of growing understanding of those sort of combined benefits and application of different management practices for those farms, and sort of even things like utilization of forage and things like that can be adapted, and you can get benefits from both, and possibly incorporating more trees into landscape. I think there's some of the trends towards very sort of commercial production are not necessarily going to continue working on certain parts of the farmland in the UK. And actually, it's not that they need to be completely removed from agricultural production, but that may be actually a more extensive farming system that combines environmental benefits with still agricultural productivity, but not quite to the same degree, may be a better fit going forward. And we can potentially deliver both and harness some natural capital and ecosystem services to help pay for that. But I think it is a pretty radical change. I think that may be in the offing, but it's not simple. And I think I sympathise with Matt's question enormously, because I think actually until people actually, or governments in particular, start accepting that by exporting our production aspects, we won't ever get a true picture of what our carbon impact is, and our water quality impact, and plastic pollution, and all of these things. So
it's a very difficult balance. I think that's the nail on the head, really. And without doubt, I mean, the shift away from direct payments to ELMs and what that means in terms of revenue for farmers, and just the way that we're going to manage land going forward is definitely going to be quite a considerable shift in mindset, I think. And it's sort of getting your head around that. But I mean, in that sense, farmers are looking to fill the gap, I suppose, fill the BPS gap going forward. I mean, and if natural capital and that option is going to be there to do maybe some of that, where would you suggest farmers start in looking at their natural capital on farm?
Yeah, so in terms of starting to look at it, I think it's important to have an understanding as to what potential there might be. And so BCM are about to sort of start rolling out some essentially initial free appraisals, and excuse me for the sort of minor pitch on that point, but
plug away.
So yeah, we'll be able to go around and do that basic scoping assessment to see what's there, what potential there is, how that fits with your existing business. So you can at least start to have that conversation and understanding. And a lot, as I said, it's fairly intuitive to a lot of people. It's what those natural benefits that are sort of arising from their farm are, but trying to actually distill that down to the things that are going to be traded, and potentially how your business can be adapted so it can fit within some potential. So that's the conversation that we want to start opening up, and then that can lead on to sort of slightly more detailed appraisals if it's something that people wish to pursue. And that may be that initial scoping is probably where they stop for now, potentially, until we start to see these markets evolve a little more. And I'm very aware that they're not there yet, a lot of the markets for this, but they're pretty imminent, I think. And I think particularly for things like carbon, if you're looking at a woodland carbon model, so woodland carbon you plant it today, you register it. In 5 years, it gets its initial verification, and then after another 10 years, you can start trading your woodland carbon credits. So you've got 15 years from planting it to being able to trade them at their full value. That's quite long term. And in 15 years, that takes us to 2036. That's 4 or 5 years before sort of a lot of people's net zero targets are coming in. So they're going to be, well, the prediction is they could be white hot by then, sort of trading credits. So that's a lot of the speculation in that market. So it doesn't mean it's the wrong time. If you think there's an opportunity to plant woodland now, I think those credits will be more valuable then. So they're as much as the market might not be there or might not be incredibly sort of popular for them now, I think it's a market that's only going to grow. So.
So I'm taking from that one of the key things is just understanding what you've got on farm now and assessing kind of the quality of what you've got on farm today, which really ties very nicely to what we talked about with Becky Wilson from with the carbon. You know, one of the things she was sort of saying was you can't demonstrate improvement if you don't know where you've started. And I guess that really applies to an awful lot of the natural capital assessment options, really. You know, if you've got to demonstrate, you know, improvement and gain, you can't do that if you don't know where you started. And you know, there's certainly been suggestion that potentially there are options under some of the elms and perhaps even the sustainable farming incentive where you might be able to utilise the payments there and the models there to improve what you've got. So I mean, I guess that's why there is some importance in assessing what you have today to be able to demonstrate where you've got to, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it's going to. I think natural capital assessments, or however they are termed, will be almost a prerequisite for some of those bigger schemes as well, to sort of assess what your baseline is. It's a bit like the old farm environment plans and records, isn't it, under the HLS, but with a bit more data going alongside it.
So you're getting your ducks in a row and knowing where you're at today is probably quite important. You did also just mention, I think previously mentioned cluster groups and whether or not that's obviously going to be a part of the higher levels of elms. I mean, do you think there's potential for farmers to come together to deliver some of these things? Or
yeah, I think there will, and I think from a trading perspective, so you've got 10, 15, 20 farmers in a cluster group who all want to contribute a few hectares of carbon trading or some sort of other offsetting. It's much easier for them to come together, find a single market for all of that carbon, and essentially then that purchaser of the carbon has only got to negotiate with essentially one collective sort of seller, and although there'll be individual agreements for each of them, it's a much easier marketing arrangement than it is for each of those 20 farmers and landowners to go out and try and find separate partners. So I think from a brokering perspective, it will make a huge difference. And I think, I mean, there are other benefits from cluster groups as well, but I strongly encourage them, especially while there's some support out there for them. I think that maybe weaned off as it becomes slightly more of a stick than a carrot. So.
No, that sounds very logical indeed. Great. Well, I think I've covered all the questions that we've had sent through and mine. So did you just want to do a quick roundup on kind of where you want to finish, Ollie, or if there's anybody else wants to wave at me for any more questions? But I think that's it. But
Ruth's asked one question actually in the chat box that's private, but not private. She's asked, do you know if the schemes for trading are all very long term? So at the minute, nitrates are very long term. So we're looking at sort of taking nitrates out of production in what they call perpetuity, which is generally treated as being over 100 years. So that is very long term. And woodland carbon is essentially paid in 10-year installments based on the amount of carbon that is accumulated in those 10-year intervals. But obviously, woodland is a very long-term plan. So generally speaking, a lot of those models are very long-term because you're looking at taking something that has a very long life, like carbon, out of the environment. But I think things like potentially like public access, they may be on shorter term agreements. It may not be about creating sort of permanent public rights of way, but providing access onto land for a defined period, or so I think there will be some things that are shorter term. I mean, we've seen examples emerging elsewhere where actually soil carbon I think it was in France, is being traded on an annual basis because of the soil carbon that they're sequestering in that period. But it's not a model that anyone I think is immediately talking about replicating in the UK, but it may be something, and you get paid essentially for soil carbon locked up in that 1 year cycle. So
very interesting, very interesting. No, well, I think well, thank you for picking that one up. I haven't seen that one, but that's great. And yeah, no, I think we've covered a lot of really interesting things. That I think this is a conversation that is going to grow and expand over the next 12 months. Really, I mean, we've seen a massive leap in the information and the assessments and all of the things surrounding natural capital, and just the conversation around it. Really, in a very short space of time, and without doubt, this is very intertwined with elms, so it's going to be a conversation we're going to be having again going forward when I think there's a bit more clarity. But I think, you know, the takeaway from this is that whatever you might be thinking about doing going forward, knowing what you have got today and where you stand today, and you know what your footprint is really important. And I think that's really kind of been the focus of our series. Really, is just getting to grips with where you stand in terms on your farm. So thank you very much for that, for Ollie. Really appreciate you joining us this evening. And yeah, thank you for everyone else that's joined us. So we are hopefully going to be looking at doing perhaps a farm walk to get everybody physically together over the summer months. So but we'll get some more information out to everybody on that in due course. But in the meantime, have a good evening. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll speak to you all again soon. Thank you.